Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest EP from Bring Me the Horizon, music to listen to, so on and so forth. I'm not going to say the whole title of this project because it's pretty lengthy, and yeah, just look it up yourself. I'll probably have it in the description or something. But yeah, this is the newest EP from Bring Me the Horizon, which was a surprise release, something I wasn't really expecting considering the fact that the band dropped a full-length album earlier this year back in January. And this EP is also pretty noteworthy because not only is the title of this thing pretty lengthy, but the actual project itself is really lengthy too. This EP is about an hour and 15 minutes long, which is much longer than any EP typically is, but in most sources I see online, this is classified as an EP. In fact, I even saw several interviews with the band saying that they didn't want to release albums anymore, just EPs. So I guess this is an EP then. If this apparently isn't and this is a studio album or something, I guess I'll change the title of this video. But as of right now, as far as I'm concerned, this is an EP and not an album, regardless of its length. It's kind of funny. This almost feels like the opposite of a lot of those short, like 20-something minute long albums that we've been getting recently. It's just a really lengthy EP instead. But regardless of that, what about the music itself here on this project? Well, the music here is also pretty interesting too, and much like the length of this thing, really odd as well. Bring Me the Horizon are a group that have changed their sound pretty consistently throughout their career, originally starting as a deathcore act, but moving to the point where on their most recent output they've been blending together elements of pop rock, electronic rock, alternative metal, pop punk, all of those different styles of music. And personally I prefer a lot of their newer output just because I think the songwriting has improved with time for the band. But on this new release here, the band just goes full out weird experimental electronic music to the point where a lot of the songs on this thing are just completely different than anything I was expecting to see from Bring Me the Horizon at any point in their career. It's a really interesting experiment here on this EP, but I do think to some extent that it could have been performed a bit better than it actually is here on this project. I will say that I do respect the heck out of this project to some extent, because the fact that the band decided to do something like this at all even is just really impressive, and the fact that they actually went through with it, it's kind of cool and all. It's just that I think what they actually decided to do here with regards to the sounds that they experiment with, it could have just been done a little bit better than what we actually get here on this project. I think the biggest issue with this EP for me personally is the fact that a lot of it feels a lot more drawn out than it needs to be. Certain tracks on here feel like they just go on for a bit too long, maybe at best, but at worst just way too long. A lot of these sounds and ideas that they play around with sound pleasant on their own, but they're just at times stretched out so far to the point where they kind of lose what made them interesting to begin with. I will say that the EP starts out rather strongly in my opinion. The opening cut to this thing, Steal Something, is one of the stronger cuts on this thing. I especially like some of the horns that are worked into this track. I think they sound pretty cool. My only complaint with this song really is something I kind of alluded to before, that being that it does feel maybe a bit longer than it needs to be. This is definitely one of the better tracks on the record, and the fact that it doesn't feel as drawn out as some of the other songs on this thing, and I think the longer runtime of this track actually gets pulled off a lot better than a lot of the other songs on this thing, as I just think the sounds and ideas mixed into this song just sound better than a majority of the other ones on this project. But even still, this track feels a bit longer than it needs to be. Moving into the second track on this thing, I also think this is another one of the stronger cuts here, though it's also one of the shorter ones overall. I think this EP just starts off a bit stronger than it ends up being a bit later on in the project, as once you move towards the middle of this thing, I think it starts to dip in quality a fair bit. The song A Devastating Liberation is a track that is one of the shorter ones on this thing, but it really just kind of feels like an extended interlude cut between some of the bigger, more fleshed out songs on this thing, and because of that it still feels kind of drawn out and longer than it needs to be, even though it is one of the shorter cuts on here, like I said. You then move into the track featuring Halsey on this thing, which kind of surprised me because it just kind of sounds to some extent almost like a remix of the track In the Dark off their last full-length release, which is a song I actually quite liked from that album, but this version here sounds a bit spacier. Of course, it's kind of rearranged to fit the context of this new project a lot more. It's spacier, some of the lyrics are changed too, the flow of the track is a bit different as well, but the same core melody that was present in that track is present here, and some of the lyrics make their way onto this thing too. I know that one of the big differences here on this version of the track is that Halsey's really doing all the vocal performances on this track. And when it comes to this newer, reworked version of the song, if you want to call it that, I don't like it quite as much as the original. It's definitely the most accessible cut on this thing. Overall, I think it might be a standout to some people on this thing because of that, but I don't think Halsey's vocal performance on this thing is really all that fantastic. It's just kind of average, not quite as good as it was in the original track. And the instrumental here, while, it's fine to listen to, I guess, it's not one of the more memorable ones on this project. And I don't know, it just kind of feels unnecessary to some extent, I feel. The next track on the record, though, is one of the most interesting, though, Underground Big. This is the longest song on the record, being almost 25 minutes in length. And it starts off fairly interesting, I will say. It begins essentially as like this trap rap sort of song, which is definitely something I didn't really expect to see, but it's pulled off decently enough, I guess, towards the start. It then kind of shifts sounds a bit more, moving into a more electro-pop focused sound that, once again, is a bit more reminiscent of the band's last release, before moving into one of the few moments on this project where the band kind of pulls together a heavier metal sound on this thing. It's pretty brief in the greater scheme of this album's runtime, but it was kind of nice to see something a little heavier mixed into things too. However, after this point on the track, which is only a few minutes into this thing, the track moves into this very repetitive electronic beat that's looped over and over again, which I will say doesn't sound too bad, but it's just not the most interesting when it's looped on for like around 20 minutes or so of the track's total runtime. And really all you have going over this are just some spoken word vocals talking about a variety of different subjects, really talking about the band themselves and their authenticity as a band, and the end of the world, and problems in the world, and not eating meat, and just a whole bunch of things, really. And it's just not the most interesting thing to listen to, I will say. In fact, I'd probably say this portion of the track is the low point of the album as a whole, as it really embodies a lot of what I don't care for in this project. It's very repetitive. It's just not very interesting. With the spoken word vocal thing over this isn't super interesting either. It just sounds very rambly. I don't feel like there's much of a point to it. Like, there are maybe smaller points brought up in what's being said here, but it never really ties together to make a super cohesive message. And the way it's just kind of put together isn't super interesting to listen to either. After listening through it once, I really felt like I got everything I needed to get from it. And upon repeated listens, this track just grew to be more and more annoying to me, as after the first few minutes of the track, which admittedly are some of the more interesting moments on the record, it just moves to being very bland and uninteresting, I guess. I can see what the band was trying to do here, but it just didn't get pulled off as nicely as I think it could have. Fortunately, to some extent, I feel like the last three tracks on this record pick up the quality a little bit more compared to some of the previous songs. I wouldn't say any of these last three tracks are particularly great or anything, but the way that they mix certain sounds together are just a bit more interesting. These songs aren't quite as lengthy and bloated compared to some of the other tracks on the record. That's not to say that they aren't still lengthy tracks, but I feel like the way that they use their runtime is a lot more appropriate compared to some of the tracks on this thing, like Underground Big, for example. In fact, the track Dead Dolphin Sounds is one of the stronger points on this record as a whole, in my opinion. I think the vocal line on this track is very hypnotic, very repetitive, but in a way that's kind of catchy and sort of memorable too. Even though it's one of the longer tracks in this final stretch of songs on the record, I think it's one of the standouts on this thing as a whole. Overall, this record is just one that's kind of frustrating for me because, on the one hand, I really respect the fact that the band decided to try something really new and different here on this thing, because while the band has toyed around with electronic sounds before in the past, they've almost always been exclusively in the context of more traditional song structures, just poppier song structures, whereas on this thing, they're a lot more experimental and out there, and the song structures on this thing are far from poppy and conventional, maybe with the exception of the Halsey track, like I said before. All the other ones on this thing really tend to lack a typical song structure, which I find to be kind of admirable in a sense, but at the same time, I feel like the execution of these ideas is just kind of lacking at times on this thing. I feel like there's certain parts of this thing that are just drawn out way, more than they need to be. There's certain parts of this thing where the instrumentals maybe aren't quite as interesting as they need to be, or certain ideas just don't hit as hard as I think that the band was hoping that they would. So overall, yeah, I find this record kind of frustrating. I respect it, I think, more than I actually like it, but I feel like if the band wanted to try something like this again and maybe made the record a bit more concise and focused sounding, it could actually work out to be a lot more interesting. Because I feel like if you take what you get here on this EP and shorten it to some extent, really focus on the parts that already work and maybe cut out some of the parts that don't work, I think you could have had a really concise, interesting project that was still a lot more experimental than anything the band had done previously, but was also a lot more interesting to listen to than what you actually get here on this release. So overall, if you're a Bring Me the Horizon fan, I would say this is certainly worth giving at least a listen to because it's so interesting and strange. In fact, even if this you're not a Bring Me the Horizon fan and this project just sounds like something that might interest you, I would say give this a listen because it certainly is a unique project, unlike anything they've done before. But whether or not you're going to enjoy it or not, I think is something that's a bit more difficult to tell ahead of time. At least for me personally, I didn't really end up enjoying this thing all that much. Like I said before, I think I respect this thing a lot more than I ended up enjoying it, but I guess I'm kind of happy at least that the band is trying new things out still, and I'm interested to see where they go next on their next EP or album or whatever they decide to call what the next collection of material they're going to be dropping is, because this was certainly at least an interesting little experiment. I mean, it's not a little experiment, it's a pretty lengthy experiment, but it was interesting, I guess, and I can kind of respect that. But overall, yeah, that's just my own personal opinion on this thing. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this project in the comment sections down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. I'm currently in the middle of putting out my 2019 year-end list, so if you want to see that stuff, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.